Welcome to the 2023 Bleaseling Quilt Along. I'm Laura Struck from Made Peachy, and over this series of videos we're going to work towards creating a sampler quilt. This 9-block sampler quilt features a selection of products from the Bleaseling quilting range, and each video will walk you through the process of start to finish to create each unique quilting block. Block number 2 in the sampler quilt is a Churn Dash block. And we have worked using Bleaseling Quilter's Grid to create our neat Churn Dash block. Block number 2 in the sampler quilt is a Churn Dash block, and we're going to be making that using Bleaseling Quilter's Grid. The supplies that we need to make this block are some fabrics. I've chosen contrasting colours here, and we need a rotary cutter, ruler and cutting mat, and also a pair of sharp scissors. Bleaseling Quilter's Grid is a fusible interlining, and it features a 1-inch grid square, and it's this grid square that we're going to be using to create our block motif. Because this is a fusible product, I'm going to be working with Bleaseling iron-on pressing cloth when I apply my fabrics and fuse them onto the Quilter's Grid. The Churn Dash block is created by using half square triangles and fence rail sections. So I've cut the fabrics to give our centre square, which is exactly 3-inch square. The squares that are going to form the half square triangles, the finished half square triangles are going to measure 3-inch square to match the centre block. So these squares measure 4 3/4 inches square. And the fence rail strips, we need 4 of those, and I'm making them with 2 strips, and these measure 1 3/4 inches by 12 inches. The Quilter's Grid has been cut to 9 inches or 9 squares by 9 squares, and that will give us 3 rows of 3-inch blocks for the design. So on the Quilter's Grid there is a grid printed on the reverse, and this is the non-fusible side. So this is the side we're going to be using for placing our stitching and placing our fabrics. And the other side, where the grid is slightly fainter in appearance, has a rough texture, and that's the adhesive side. So that's the side we're going to be fusing the fabrics. Let's first start by preparing our fabrics for sewing. The first element I'm going to create is the fence rail section. The fence rail section is made with 2 strips, and we're going to place these right sides to right sides, and I'm going to secure them along the raw edges with some clips. And we can take these to the sewing machine, and we're going to work with a 1/4-inch seam the entire length of the strip, and that will give us our sections of fence rail. Once the seam has been worked 1/4 inch from the raw edge, I'm simply going to use my iron to just work over that seam before folding the darker of the 2 fabrics over, allowing it to sit with all of the seam allowance underneath. So all of the seam allowances are going to be pressed over to this dark of the 2 fabrics. So just using the iron just to carefully press and work the entire length of the strip. At the cutting mat, I'm going to use my rotary cutter and ruler, and I'm simply going to begin by squaring off the lower section, and I'm going to work all the way around here. So I'm going to position my ruler to create 4 3-inch blocks. So I'm using the ruler as a guide to get the right size, but also to ensure that this seam section where the 2 colours meet will run directly central to the block. So simply cutting to reveal the fence rail section. Once you've finished cutting all 4 of the fence rail blocks, they can be repressed and set aside ready to construct the block. There are a number of different ways to make the half square triangles. The method I'm going to use will yield me 4 half square triangles in one go. So I've cut my fabric here to measure 4 3/4 inches square, and I'm going to place my second fabric on top. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be working as a line of stitching the entire way round, so sealing up those 2 squares, and then we're going to be making cuts diagonally, and that will create the 4 half square triangles, and the finished measurement for those is going to be 3-inch square. Of course, you can add a stitching line if you prefer, so you can use an air erase or a water erase marker just to mark on where you're going to be working your stitching, and this helps just for making it nice and quick. especially if you've not used this technique before. It's a really handy way to keep you on track. So we're going to be working the 4 lines of stitching the entire way around. These lines here that I'm marking are 1/4 of an inch away from the raw edge, so that's where our stitching will be. Once it's stitched, we're going to then be cutting diagonally, so I can go ahead and mark those lines on as well, and we will use them once they're stitched. So they go corner to corner, working the entire way through the centre to create one cut line and our second cut line. So all the way through the centre. So now before I go to stitch, I'm just going to pop a couple of pins in place, and that will make sure that it's all held in position neatly for me to sew. At the sewing machine, I've dropped my needle down onto this line which I've marked, and it's the 1/4 of an inch from the raw edge, and I'm just going to begin stitching. So I'm using a straight stitch, and it's a size 2mm stitch, and I'm just going to work the whole length of that seam. So I'm using a 80 needle, and I'm combined that with a 50 weight thread, and that's just going to keep my stitches nice and neat without too much bulk. So take it right to the corner with my needle down, lift the presser foot to pivot, and I'm just going to continue working the whole way around the block, just working those seams all the way to the end. Now that we've seamed the entire way around our square, we can slip out the pins and we can cut along our cut lines and reveal the half square triangles. So I'm going to position my ruler on my diagonal cut line, working from one corner to the next, and carefully cut that, and then I can rotate round, reposition the ruler, and cutting all the way diagonally. And now I can open up my work and reveal the half square triangle that measures 3 inches square. To finish preparing these half square triangles ready to add to our block, I am just going to quickly press everything open. So the darker fabric is the side that I'm going to have uppermost, and what I'm going to do is just carefully ease the upper portion over, and using the iron just press that out. So in doing so, I'm pushing all of the seam allowance over to the darker of the two fabrics. I'm going to repeat that. So I have my fabric uppermost, push over and press so that all of the seam allowance is over onto the darker fabric. I'm going to quickly take these back to the cutting mat and snip away the excess fabrics that lie here on the seam allowance, and then these blocks are ready to add in. With all the pieces cut, we have 4 fence rail sections, a centre block, and 4 of the half square triangles. We can begin to construct the churn dash block. I've placed the quilter's grid with the grid side facing down, so we want the fusible side uppermost because we're going to be fusing the fabrics onto our block. I'm going to start in the upper corner here, and I'm going to use the grid line as a guide and position on my first block. So I'm going to pop that into place, and then the next block in the series is going to be a fence rail, which is placed in that orientation. And again, over here we have another half square triangle. So I'm just going to position them carefully, following the pattern around. You'll soon see the design becoming clear as we work. Put my centre block and another fence rail section, and create the final row by placing in the last half square triangles and fence rail. And we can see there we've got our churn dash block. Next, we're going to use our iron and fuse these fabrics onto our quilter's grid. So the quilter's grid is this fusible layer here, and I like to use a pressing cloth on top. I'm going to use the Fleeceline iron-on cloth, and I have actually dampened this one, and the best part about it being damp is not only will it give a bit of steam to create some moisture whilst we're fusing the fabrics on, it also becomes transparent when it's damp, and I can therefore see that I haven't popped my pressing cloth down and everything slid to one side. So once I'm happy that everything's covered, I'm going to go in with my iron. So I'm using the iron on a number 2 heat setting, And I'm simply going to press the iron into place, hold for a few seconds, and this allows the glue to bond onto the fabric. Lift, reposition and repress. So it's a case of lifting and pressing. I try to avoid sliding the iron across the surface in the way that we would iron a garment, just in case it causes the fabrics to drift and then you end up fusing something in a position that you are unhappy with. Once all of the block's been fused, we can then remove the pressing cloth. So the bonus of using the Bleasine iron cloth is where we've got the sections of interfacing here that have gone beyond the surface of the fabric. That's not coming in contact with the iron plate, so we're not getting that burnt onto the iron. I'm just carefully removing it. Everything is always a bit hot once you've been using the iron and fusing it. So I will lift my work off of my iron pad and leave it on the table to cool. So I'm going to leave this for around 30 minutes, and that allows the adhesive to fully bond with the fabric and set nice and firmly. Now that the fabrics have cooled and the adhesive has fully bonded, we can go ahead and complete the block. So to complete this block, we need to work 2 vertical seams and 2 horizontal seams. The way the seams are worked is we're going to be folding the project right side to right side, and we're going to be using the grid lines on the back as our stitching guide. Now you can see where I've got slight gaps in between my fabrics. This isn't a problem because where we're folding, we're going to be encasing that section within the seam, so all of these gaps will disappear. And that's one of the real benefits of using Quilter's grid, is it allows you to create very, very neat finish. Let's begin preparing this first seam. So I'm going to fold the fabric right side to right side where these 2 blocks join. And I'm just going to check on the back and just check that I'm following that printed line all the way across on the grid. I'm going to finger press and I'm going to secure with some clips ready to stitch. I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and I'm going to work a line of stitching all the way down top to bottom to work that first seam. Here at the sewing machine, I've aligned my needle so that I'm going to be working a line of straight stitching all the way down this length, and it's going to be positioned 1/4 of an inch from this folded edge. So using this folded edge on the grid as a guide. I'm working with an 80 needle and I'm using 50 weight thread, and that's going to give me nice light seams, not too much bulk in the seams. I've chosen a 2mm stitch length and it's a straight stitch, so just working all the way along using the folded edge as a guide to create that first seam. With this first seam, straight vertical seam, having been worked, we can now open that section and just reveal how that section looks. So we can see here we've got a lovely neat seam, and any gaps we had in the fabric have actually been enclosed in that seam. So we're going to go ahead and work the second seam in the same manner, folding right sides to right sides, using the line as a guide and pressing before pinning or clipping in place, ready to stitch. So the second vertical seam's been worked in exactly the same manner, and again opening it we can reveal how our block is coming together. We're going to proceed and do the exact same technique of folding and stitching on the reverse using the grid line for these last 2 horizontal seams. I'm just going to take a look at the back of the work. So where we're going to be working this seam, we're going to be folding our project in half here. Where this intersects here with the vertical and the horizontal seam, we're going to get quite a lot of bulk. The quickest way to resolve that is to take a pair of sharp scissors and just work a small snip at the sections where the horizontal and vertical seams are going to intersect. So all of those 4 elements, making small slips just into the seam allowance, being really careful not to cut the stitching. Now the reason for doing that is when we then take our block and we fold right side to right side, we can align our grid, and it actually allows us to manipulate the seam allowance. So rather than having them sitting on top of each other as they are here, which is going to create some bulk, we can actually push one to one side and one to the other, creating a nesting effect. So I'm going to go ahead and nest those seams, popping in some clips and take that to the sewing machine to stitch. Working the horizontal seams is done in exactly the same manner as working the vertical seam. So it's a straight stitch and it's positioned 1/4 inch from that folded edge right there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that every time I get to these intersections, I'm going to ensure that the seam allowances are nested. That's the only difference between the vertical and horizontal seams. So just ensuring that they're lying as flat as possible and working all the way to the end of the seam. Having completed the first horizontal seam, we've nested our seam allowances there, and pressing it open we can really reveal how the block is going to look when it's finished. So again, all of the gaps in the fabric have been folded inside of those seams and they're no longer visible. I'm going to do the exact same principle again. I'm going to be folding over right side to right side and nesting my seams. Where I've already nested them on these intersections here, I'm just going to ensure that I follow the orientation of the fabric so as not to create a twist on the reverse of the work. So I'm just nesting those seams, securing with a clip and nesting those seams, securing, and then I'm ready to take that to the sewing machine and work the final seam all the way along that length. So the final seam has been worked and we've used the same manner to nest all the seams, so we've got a lovely neat finish on the back of the work. We can open out the block and reveal the finished churn dash. So taking the finished block over to the pressing mat, I'm just going to press over all of the seams to neaten. Now here, where I've got the excess of quilter's grid extending beyond the fabric, I'm just going to replace the pressing cloth, the Vliseline iron-on pressing cloth, and I'm going to use that just as a bit of extra protection so that my iron can go right to the edges of the fabric and I'm not touching that adhesive, and it's protecting the sole plate of my iron so I won't have any adhesive burnt onto there, which can then transfer onto my fabrics. So now the churn dash block is now ready to be quilted. Be sure to check out the other videos in the series to create all 9 blocks of your sampler quilt. You can find our Quilt As You Go method video in the series also, and this will show you how to piece together your finished sampler quilt. Thank you so much for joining me for the Vliseline 2023 Quilt Along. You can find out more about the Vliseline products on the Vliseline website at vliseline.com, and you can follow us on social media on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube at Vliseline UK. You can find me online at madepeachy.com. Please do share your projects online and tag us in your makes. We do love to see them.